So we are back for another live teaching. So excited, excuse my tardiness, but I am back for another live teaching. This is going to be the part 3 of a Pharaoh versus Abraham case study that we have embarked on. An overview of what we talked about in the first case study. So in our first case study, so for Pharaoh versus Abraham, for identifying the Pharaohs, the Pharaoh versus Abraham, we are in Genesis, right? And so the Pharaoh of this time, we are identifying the Pharaoh of this time and what the Pharaoh was coming to acquire. So with this series, we are identifying the Pharaohs of the time. They are already here. A lot of them are already active within the land, within nations. And also, some are even rising into power with the things with the changes that are happening within the things of our world. And so you have to know why they are rising in power, who Pharaoh is, what they're coming to acquire. Because with Pharaohs, they're always coming to acquire something. There's an acquisition in place that they are coming to take. And so with this series, that's what we're going more into, is like what they're coming to take, why they're rising, what's behind it. And so the first Pharaoh we talked about Pharaoh versus the Israelites. That was the case study where we kind of dived into what that Pharaoh was acquiring. Now, this Pharaoh that we're talking about, we're using the case study of Pharaoh versus Abraham. It's in the Bible, a book in the Bible, starting in Genesis. And I'll have the chapters as we go on. But with this Pharaoh is coming to ravish the remnants. Now, for you to understand what the remnants are, for you to even understand the complexities of Pharaoh, I did do a previous teaching, that the first live teaching that we did, and we kind of went over all of Pharaoh, ancient Egypt. We kind of went over that whole infrastructure, right, for you to understand what Pharaoh really is, because it's not just a powerful man. It's not just ancient Egypt wasn't just a powerful nation. There was so many complexities and layers and nuances to the seat of Pharaoh. But to just sum that all up, so Pharaoh is not just a seat of position. It's a seat of position that a man holds, right? And it's through lineage, through blood, and through worship and rituals to deities, right? To hold that space, because they're being looked at as gods, right? They're being looked at as this divine order that's sent down from the gods of the realms to facilitate and, govern over the people of the nation, right? And so with that though, but Pharaoh itself is a system, is an institution, it's a complex system, and complex systems can easily form into institutions with the right infrastructure. And so it is an institution of complex systems, right? But it's the system of oppression. And it's not just any type of oppression, it is deep oppression, like the type of oppression where you do not escape, where you do not get out, like where you live and die, where the system seeks to like wring you out like a cloth that's wet, and you know how you wring out the water or a sponge, like that, wring you out till there's nothing left within you. And so for this Pharaoh at the time, we are identifying, now again, there's various Pharaohs, right? Throughout history, throughout time, there's various Pharaohs. They had already risen in power, but there was prominent events within history that changed the trajectory of destinies, changed the trajectory of nations, of countries, of other kingdoms, due to what was happening in the land, right? Due to what was happening also spiritually, because I know a lot of people don't want to talk about the spiritual element of things, but when you talk about Pharaoh, when you even talk about ancient Egypt, you have to talk about spirituality, because they were polytheistic. So they had multiple, over 20,000 deities that they served, right? So spirituality was a big part of their lifestyle, was of their identity. And so we have to talk about the complex spiritual systems that these covenants and rituals held to the altar that ancient Egypt preserved, and even the Nile being that of a divine entity and sanction for them, right? In more ways of just not physical and providing the provisions and the water and just all the things, there was also a divine place, divine sanctioned entity. So So this Pharaoh we're identifying is coming for the remnants. Now, you have to understand what remnants are. I'm going to give just a brief overview of the first two teachings of this. I did break this up into 3 teachings because it was actually just a lot of information. And I mean, it gets really deep. And so I didn't want it to be overwhelming. And so when we talk about remnants, the Hebrew word for remnants is she'erith, right? And it means to remain, to be left over, something that's left, that's reserved, that's the rest, that's the residue or residual. And so we kind of talked about understanding the remnant of who was the remnant. Why did we even get to Abraham? Like, how did this even get to Abraham? Like, how is he a part of the preservation of the remnant? How did, like, Abraham's life, even his brief tension and encounter with Pharaoh, how that would have changed the trajectory of the remnant, of the destiny and purpose and promise to the remnant. And so we kind of just had to unpack what remnant was, what it looked like, why there was such a distinct separation between all of the other people within the earth and this remnant that was saved, why there was faithfulness and grace given to them. And so kind of the things that I had questions of reflection was like, you know, what's blocking your residuals? What's blocking your residue? Are you a part of a remnant? You know, where have you been the remaining few of something, whether it's community, whether it's school, whether it's, you know, wherever you are, you know, and how did you survive? What did you survive? You know, what if it's generational, where you have, you know, within your lineage, you can track where, you know, the few of your generations within your lineage have been reserved, right? Have been saved. Why did they survive? Why were they kept alive? And so that's where we went into the remnants, right? So we kind of explained that, and then I kind of went also into a little bit about Abraham, about his life, about how, you know, even the journey of Abraham within his life like reflected the journey of his lineage before him, you know, because there was patriarchs before him that held on to this covenant, this promise, right? And so it all ties into the remnant. And so for part 2, we talked about, we really kind of got into Abraham's life, and then we kind of got into the tension. But with talking about Abraham's life, there was several things that we kind of went over. So I'm just going to briefly talk about it. But in this part 2 that we did, we talked about really where like greed, sex, lies, and how uncertainty can position you into a place that puts you kind of in the direct sight of Pharaoh, right? In the direct sight of something that has an insatiable appetite, right? That can't be necessarily fulfilled, but is willing to acquire whatever, however, because it's looking for something deeper. And so the uncertainty with Abraham, we kind of started with, you know, his walk within, and this is sorry, I forgot to mention the scriptures, but this is all within Genesis chapters 11, and then this specific part 2 was in Genesis chapter 12 and 13. We focused on a little bit of chapter 13, verse 1 through 4, but all of chapter 12. And so we were talking about the events of Abraham's life and him being commissioned, and again how he was connected to the remnant that was saved, starting with Noah, and like just all of those change of events. And I've kind of showed you throughout history how it all kind of aligned and connected, and then how and why this showdown happened, and also why did he even be able to confront or be in proximity to this specific Pharaoh that is coming for the remnants. And it comes back to this teaching now where we're talking about, so we understand the remnants, we understand how Abraham played a part in it, and we understand how it impacts your lineage, right? It impacts your promise, impacts the things within your life that are saved, that are preserved, that are meant to be fruitful for your descendants and your lineage to come, right? Because we kind of even showed within Abraham's life how the patriarchs, each patriarch that took upon the mantle, that took upon the promise, that took upon this covenantal promise and discipleship and responsibility and stewardship of it, it was for, you know, leading up to Abraham. Now, of course, it was for future leading up to the coming of Jesus Christ of Nazareth, right? And him being the ultimate promise, the one savior, right? But he needed a bloodline, a pure bloodline. So these patriarchs were preserving the purity of the bloodline throughout. And so they had, stewardship and discipleship and responsibilities, and they had to live, in a way that was specifically pleasing, that pertained to the specific covenant. And with the remnant, and we all have a remnant. We might not know what it is, but this is your time to kind of understand it and start thinking about what that is. Or even if you are the remnant, right, where you've had generations or ancestors before you that have preserved and have stayed the course in a way so that you could be preserved where you're at, where you're saved now, to be able to continue and to fulfill the mantle upon your life. So all of that. But pretty much the Pharaoh is trying to jeopardize the future lineage, right? The legacy, the preservation, trying to delay the destiny, delay the promise, delay purpose, the forthcoming and the birthing. It all aligns. So there's so much at stake, and and then we kind of talked about within the part 2, the last teaching of the rights, right? Because we kind of talked about how Abraham even got to Egypt. There was a famine in Canaan, and so he was like, oh, I'm a detour over to Egypt, just so that he already had riches and things, but he wanted to ensure that, his riches and what he had, he was able to not only just keep them, right, but still even gain more throughout the famine to, take care of his family. And it's kind of like what we see now, where there's people with money, right, but they're, moving their banks overseas and moving their money overseas to kind of preserve their nest egg, to ensure that if anything happens, then they're able to have what they need. So it's kind of the same thing that we're seeing now. But this uncertainty that he had, right, for the promise that he was told, ended up putting him in Egypt at a time where he should not have been, right? And this is where we come into the story of the recap of then he became and the straight line, Pharaoh saw his wife. Now he knew his wife was beautiful. He knew his wife. It talked about it in Genesis chapter 12, how beautiful his wife was. And so he had told his wife, tell them that we're just brother and sister. Don't tell them we're husband and wife, because they'll kill me to acquire you. Now we kind of also went into the protocols of ancient Egyptian marriage rituals, of not just common Egyptians, but also royalty and Pharaoh and their common customs of marriage and things like that, and how Abraham selling his wife to Pharaoh, because Pharaoh paid a dowry, a bride price for her, put her into covenant, right, and gave Pharaoh the rights to her womb, right, the rights to fertility, the rights to production, right? But earlier in chapter 12, there was already a promise, right, to Abraham of him being a great nation. Now, Sarah was barren at the time, so she did not have kids. They did not have kids. However, there was a promise on Abraham's life due to him being a part of the remnant of his previous descendants and lineage that preserved their covenantal promise. And so Abram was risen as one of the deliverers of the remnant to ensure and move forward the promise, right, of what was to come. And so him selling his wife put her in Pharaoh's house. Now, with Pharaoh's house, we kind of went into his harem, his concubines, how that all happened, what that was. It was diplomacy. It was political. It was very strategic. It was very, they said in research, it was very expensive to maintain. But it was well worth it to Pharaoh, because it expanded his dynastic building, his political infrastructure, the security of his royal household internationally, right? And so, yeah, he acquired all of them. When famine came, when there was uncertainty, when there was wars, it said diplomats and priests and, people from all over would sell their daughters to Pharaoh. And he would acquire them because they would become a part of his harem. And I kind of went into the previous teaching of what that is, what all that entails, what their children would grow up to be like, all of that. So if you want that live teaching, that is also on the page. You can click the link. It gives you the direct link to YouTube and you can watch the full teaching on that. But pretty much we are coming into the tension of why then Pharaoh's house was plagued, right? So there was plague sent on Pharaoh's house, and it wasn't just like his main household of his main wife, because there is a main wife that every Pharaoh has, but then they have secondary wives, they have harems, they have concubines and things like that. So they all make up the totality of Pharaoh's household. Also his servants, the diplomats, the priests, the administrators that kind of handled the complexities of the secondary compound that housed all of his secondary wives and concubines. So there was like, his household wasn't just him and his kids. Like there was a plethora of people that kind of fed into and kept the institution alive, right, of Pharaoh. And so there was plague sent on his house because he had Sarah in his household. Now, something of the tradition of Egyptians was they didn't really have these complex and like big marriage ceremonies. Sometimes they would have it, but honestly, if a woman and man wanted to be married, the woman would move into the man's house, and that signified marriage. And so Sarah moving into Pharaoh's house, that signified marriage. He also paid a dowry, so he gave Abraham cattle, he gave him all these oxen, donkeys, he gave him all these things. And that was like the bride price, and that was also like a contractual agreement. So there was a contractual agreement given that said that Sarah was now belonging to Pharaoh. Now, when Pharaoh acquires a wife, it's not just, we're married and it's contractual, but it's also by blood and by duty. And so they believed it also in Egyptians to be an eternal contract. So something that you're even bound to through in eternity. Now, again, Sarah was not, now the promise wasn't made to Sarah. It was made to Abraham that he'd be a great nation. However, Abraham was already married. Him and Sarah, they practiced monogamy. They did not have any other, outside. I mean, later down the story, he ended up having, a child by his maidservant because they got impatient with waiting for their promise of a child. But however, up until then, they didn't have any kids. And so, her wound, her fertility, the wound, the vitality of her body and her wound was connected and intertwined with the promise that God gave Abraham. So her being in a not only spiritual but eternal contract with Pharaoh, which when we talk about the spiritual complexities and religious practices of ancient Egyptians, but specifically pharaohs of the time, you would understand that Sarah being connected to those deities and her wound being connected to those deities, when out of her wound was going to come of a son, right? Another a child, a son, another patriarch that was getting ready to carry the mantle that Abraham would give him. You would understand that having that type of promise in the hands of Pharaoh is not a good thing. And so God sent plagues on Pharaoh's household, and through diviners and divinity, Pharaoh knew that it was because of Sarah, and he had confronted Abraham and said, like, why did you just tell me? Like, why did you tell me this was your sister? And so pretty much he sent them on their way, and he didn't take any of the things that he gave them, because that's also a custom with the ancient Egypt, where wherever the dowry was paid, whatever price was paid, the wife gets to keep it. So she's not destitute and left alone. You know what I mean? So, Pharaoh went through the customary protocols of divorcing Sarah from, this contract. He divorced her. He kicked her out. He kicked Abraham out. He allowed them to keep Sarah to keep what was paid for her in terms of marriage. And that was a signifying of divorce. And so that's where we're at now, and talking about that this whole showdown wasn't just tension, wasn't just, a little bit of a lie. I mean, yes, it started as a lie, but the lie was just the shallow part, because it was everything that fell up under it. Again, so if you haven't checked the other live teachings of this Pharaoh series, I would watch those first for you to really understand the complexities, because we're talking about now altar versus altar, and we're talking about the effectiveness of an altar. And so we kind of went into the last teaching in Genesis 12, where at the beginning of Abraham's commissioning, right? He would go to different parts of Canaan, and when he got there, he would erect an altar for God, right? It was an act of worship. It was an act of service. It was an act of gratitude to God. So he would erect the altar. Now, The purpose of Abraham's life, right? Because he did kind of move from place to place, but he was a key marker and a boundary setter. And we kind of talked about that too with some of the patriarchs, where we went over the meaning of their names and how they marked certain things within history. And one of the patriarchs, I can't remember the name right now, meant boundary, right? And not just boundaries and separation, but boundary. A lot of some of the other patriarchs' names meant like channel and canal. So Abraham was being used as that channel, right? Almost like a hidden channel, a hidden canal, right? That its source of water came from an unknown source, but we know it came from God, right? And so he was used as a channel going through all parts of Canaan. And as he erected an altar of God, he marked that territory, right? He put a boundary there, not just only a physical erection of an altar, right, that was built, but also spiritual. Now, we talked about ancient Egypt, right? We talked about where Abraham came from, where they did a lot of idolatry, where they were polytheistic too, and so they had a lot of deities and things. And so if you look throughout history, if you look throughout every ancient civilization, they all erected altars. Now their altars look different. So I think I'm kind of getting ahead of myself. Let me just bring up some examples, because I have two prominent examples that I know, but I just want to backtrack it because I am getting a little ahead of myself. So when Abraham built the altars to God, they were a form of worship. It was land dedication. It had spiritual significance, because those land markers would be actually the land that was specifically, so him being told to go to Canaan wasn't by just happenstance or no, it was because that was the land that his lineage and descendants after him would have, right? That was the land that God had allotted for them to have. So Abraham going through and marking altars dedicated to God was land dedication back to God, right? Was consecration of the land, right? Was marking boundaries, physical boundaries, right? With the physical altars, but also spiritual boundaries in a land, right? That it belonged to God, right? So that he could then, generations down the line, give that remnant, right, that was saved, the continuation of the remnant, give them land that was specifically for them. And they'd have the power and authority, right? They'd have provision. They'd have everything that they need. And so it just ensured that these territorial places belong to the Lord. And that, again, this was future land for the remnant, which was called the promised land. We're back in Genesis 12. This is where this is like the call of Abraham's commissioning, right? This is before he even made it to Egypt, but he had to get to Canaan, right? And so, he was told to go out of his country. He was given the promise, and this is when Abraham was 75. So he took his wife Sarah and Lot, his brother's son, and all of what they had, and they went to the land of Canaan. Now it says in chapter 12, verse 6, and Abraham passed through the land of a place of Sichem unto the plain of Moreh, and the Canaanite was then in the land. And the Lord appeared to Abraham and said, unto thy seed I will give this land, and there buildeth he an altar unto the Lord who appeared to him. So when Abraham got to a certain part of Canaan, the Lord showed up and said, this is the land that I'll give to your seed. And so that is exactly where Abraham erected an altar unto God, right? It was worship, was dedication back to God, but it also marked territory for the Lord, right? And says, so he removed from then unto a mountain on the east of Bethel, and he pitched his tent, having Bethel on the west and Hai on the east. And there he buildeth another altar unto the Lord, and called upon the name of the Lord. So then he built another altar, right? And says, and Abraham journeyed going on still toward the south. And then that's when he ran into the famine. And so altars weren't not only just geographic and regional altars. Again, they're spiritual markings and boundaries. And so something to understand when it comes to altars is the results within the land. So any land that you see, any nation, any territory, the results within that land is greatly determined by the altars that are in that land, right? The priests that man the altars, and the sacrifices, the rituals and things that are given unto the altars. And these altars are also governed by deities, right? So the altars are unto deities. And like, again, if you're looking at results, so ancient Egypt, the wealth, they were inventors, they were investors, they had a lot going on, right? Well, the result of that land was due to the deities they served, right? So they had altars erected to these deities. I mean, Pharaoh even, built houses, built temples, built places of worship, not just corporate worship, but also for these priests and things that he had to continuously worship and give sacrifices unto these deities, right? And so from there, based on the priests that were appointed, they would then govern and ensure that, everything was done in place by whatever the demands the deity was giving them. So it's not something that like, you're like, oh, I want riches. And, depending on what deity you call upon or you want to make a covenant with, they're not just going to give you something. There's always something in return that you have to give. You know what I mean? Nothing's free. So the results that you see in a land, you can track it by way of the altars that are erected in that land, and also the altars that service the specific deities. From that, then you'll know the results, why there's results in that land, what it looks like. And it's not just the glorious things that we glorify, like in the world and society glorifies, is like riches, wealth, power, governance. There's also the flip side of that, right? And also like the devotion to these altars have to be manned consistently. So whatever the terms and conditions of that covenant is, like you can't be like, oh, I don't feel like doing that today. Like that's not how that works. You know what I mean? And so you'll also see on the flip side, from the wealth, the riches, the power, you'll see the oppression, you'll see the, the poverty, all that kind of stuff. It all coincides. And so what you see as a result in a land, and you can look at the US, you can look at other countries, you can maybe look at a home country that your family comes from, and you can look at what is happening within the land, what you see that is prominent of like, this is what the land is known for, positive and negative. You can also know and tell what kind of religious practices, what altars. And a lot of times these altars could also be, now it's modernized, right? Because they still make buildings and monuments, but the buildings and monuments look a little bit different now. But like, I've noticed that here in Washington State, that we have a lot of like, they're not nomads, they're not gnomes. I call them gnomes, but they're not gnomes. They're like, what are those things called? And it's so crazy because I just watched a movie on it like a couple years ago. I can't even remember. They're not gnomes, but what's the other word for gnome? Like trolls. They're like trolls kind of thing. But we have a lot of trolls in Washington State. But they're huge, right? They're like these big, huge monuments of trolls. But if you really look at the spiritual connotation of trolls and things like that, they're very demonic. And so, but we have them throughout Washington, and like they're also acclaimed like tourist spots where everyone goes to visit these trolls. And I think there's like 8 of them here, if I recall correctly. But it's just stuff like that. Like, I know in North Carolina, they're getting ready to build, I think like a Buddhist statue that's going to be taller than the tallest one ever in the US or in the world. I know it's going to be like taller than the Statue of Liberty. But like just all of these like landmarks, right? Those are like the ones that I can think of the most. But then there's also altars and things, especially when you talk about ancient civilizations that, lived in the world before us, that are like underneath the earth, right? That ancient civilizations that were, underground, or under the water. So there's those altars still stand, right? And so and it gives territory to those deities. Now, again, these altars are spiritual markers, they're boundaries, they're systemic and structural territories. So when we talk about systemic and structural territories, so there's structure within when it comes to manning an altar, right? Erecting an altar, there's structures, right? There's terms and conditions, right? And then also when you talk about systemic was because like what happens after that's done, right? So what's a part of the agreement? Then there's other systems in place. So when we talk about ancient Egypt, yeah, here I am at my example, ancient Egypt. So they had erected a lot of altars of worship. Again, I had mentioned in a previous live teaching that the pharaohs even had storehouses. That's where they would store like their supply, their oversupply of like, you know, grain, corn, just all the things, right? But then they had these like opulent, big houses, right? That would also be named after the deities, right? So those buildings, those temples, those houses and everything, though they had named after the deities. So those were territories, those were markings. And I also found it interesting too, and during my research, that in ancient Egypt, that they had all their administration. So all their administration was also a part of the store cities. Now the store cities, again, is like where the abundance of pharaohs were stored, like all of like the grain, all of like that kind of stuff, but also like military. So some of them were like military bases where they'd have like all the food and things for, you know, the military that they would need. They would have the bunkers, you know, they would have the horses. And I saw like on YouTube, I kind of went to kind of just see like what kind of that stuff would look like. And they kind of had the 3D renderings of what it looked like. And they had like these huge stalls of all these horses and like caretakers that would take care of the horses, that would feed them, you know, because it's all for battle. So there was a lot of money, there was a lot of wealth accumulated that also went into the maintenance of these things, right? And so in these places, I realized in research, I was reading that a lot of administration of like the administration of Pharaoh, the administration of the institution and system of Pharaoh, the administration of ancient Egypt, the systems and by which everything is like, you know, governed, policies and things like that, all happened within these storage cities, but specifically within administration pillars that were dedicated to deities. And what that means is that, you know, you have not only this erected place for the deity, right, but you also have like your administration, like your systems, where every system that flows, you know, to whatever territory you have, like, you know, policies, governance, how things are governed, lifestyle, identity, culture, like, you know, all of these things, social norms, all that stuff is coming by way of the altar erected to deities. And so it's systemic structures that are set up to maintain the covenant, maintain the altar, and also maintain the outcome. And so another example that I can think of, because yes, the storehouses, they're places of administration, also Pharaoh's houses, and also the Nile River was a big altar of worship. I talked about in the first live teaching that, you know, there's a lot of research on it. There's a lot of opinions also, but they were talking about one of the rituals that Pharaoh had to do was to spill his seed, which means ejaculate into the Nile River every year, by way of covenant with the deity, to one of the original deities they believe that created all of ancient Egypt, and how he, you know, spilled his seed, he ejaculated and made two twin deities, and then from there all of creation was formed. And so, you know, it's like a cycle of reproduction, a cycle of all these things that they believe in fertility. And so that's why when I talk about fertility rites, if you think about it, from what ancient Egyptians believe in terms of fertility, they believe fertility started it. They believe reproduction started it by way of the deity that they serve, which I believe his name was Happy. I can't remember, but I think there's so many of them. And so when you think about Pharaoh wanting fertility rights, wanting rights to the womb, wanting rights to reproduction, it's kind of already within the making of the altar and covenant with the deity, because the deity that they believe started the creation, the reproduction, and they also believe that the Nile River was the divine ordinance of reproduction, of fertility, right? If you think about things being birthed, if you think about things getting new life, things like that, and so it's not far off when it comes to why Pharaoh is looking for the rights to wounds to continue. And that's kind of also, you know, the whole purpose of his harem is to continue his dynasty, to continue that, like to man that altar, to man that covenant and expand it. Like you need more people involved to continue it, you know what I mean? And so all of it is infiltrated and all of this is systemic. Another example that I went back to is Ur Chaldeans, because that was where Abraham was from. And that they were talking about in research that Ur Chaldeans was a great, I don't want to call it nation, but they were, a great, they didn't really say nation, but they were saying that it was a place of prominence. I mean, you know, they had the aristocrats, they had everything and everybody you could think of. It was wealth everywhere. But you also think that that place also mirrored ancient Egyptian. They had a lot of deities. They had a lot of people. They had a lot of different things going on. They had a lot of deity worshippers. They had they were sexually fluent. They had perverse practices. They had a lot of wealth and power. They were, again, polytheistic, so they had a lot of deities that they worship. Not just that they worship, but then also they had, like, it was a place for, you kind of think about like metropolitan places, because I know like in the US there's like these places that are called like metropolitan places where it's a mix and it's like a cultural hub, right? Like California, a cultural hub, right? Even in Seattle here, like a cultural hub. And so that's kind of what the Ur Chaldeans was a cultural hub where you had all cultures. So you're not just, and they were open to all cultures being there and all cultures being openly practiced. And so whatever deities that these people brought in their practices, they made room for that. And so it kind of mirrored ancient Egypt in a way. And so you think kind of about, when we talk about altars, there's a lot of altars there. A lot of altars. And also they had, it's called zergurats. Zergurats. I hope I'm saying that right. But the zergurats were specific temples because Ur Chaldeans, I can't remember the deity's name, but there was a specific deity over that whole territory, and they built zergurats and also temples in honor and respect. And then also when we talk about systems, right, we talk about structure. So those zergurats and those temples were at the like head of, like, it was the tallest, biggest thing that you could see in all the city, right? So everyone could see it. But also when we talk about systems and infrastructures and administration, it also was like the pivotal administration, mecca and piece of lifestyle, of culture, of identity, of social norms, because it talked about how they had certain sessions where even the children would go to the temple. They would learn the culture, they would learn the languages, they would learn, the cultural and systemic things that pertaining to that deity and how to worship and continue the identity under that deity and the covenant with the deity for that land and territory. So you think about in terms of administration, like it's not just it's from the top down, but then also kind of like in the in-between, because they had, it for not only adults, but even children. Like children were being cultivated and educated in that way of life. And that's the same thing that was happening in ancient Egypt, specifically also in Pharaoh's house when it comes to the secondary compound that he had with all of his concubines and harem and secondary wives. They talked about that being also not only just a place of diplomacy and political alliances and things like that, and of birthing, but also it's a nursery, not only a nursery for the children that these women birth, but also like the women that he would come in, these princes and princesses, women of young age, maybe even older age, but they would come in and they would come into the nursery and be inundated and indoctrinated with the language, the culture, the way of life, the lifestyle, all those kind of things. And so when you think about in terms of systemic and structural institutional things, when it comes to an altar and admin, it all kind of entwines. And with all of that, then it then leads to identity, and it leads to character and characteristics. Well, I'm sorry, it leads to the character and characteristics, and then that leads to an identity, because then people find identity into what they are told through systems of how to be, how to move, how to think, the way of life. And so yeah, these altars are very important. And so when we talk about, what happened and what transpired in Genesis 12 between, Pharaoh and Abraham, it was two different altars. it was the altar of God and like the altar of Pharaoh. And they was going at it, right? But of course, God prevailed. Pharaoh kicked them out, sent them on their way. But we talk about the effectiveness of an altar is definitely determinant on, the priests that are over that altar, how that altar is manned, the administration, the systems that are put in place to continue to facilitate that altar, to keep that covenant, and then, what comes out of it. Something that I also noticed within just reading everything and just recapping, because this teaching is kind of teaching you the effectiveness of an altar and what happens, but also going to be a recap of all of the other two teachings. But I noticed that the indulgence, right? The indulgence within a kingdom, a dynasty, a nation, a land is an indicator of several things. And so this is something that you can also think about in terms of the U.S. or wherever you live. Think about the indulgences of the land, the nation, the state, the territory you live in. There's always key indicators. So the key indicators of what are the areas of influence, the operational structures. Well, we just talked about the systemic and administration things, but what are the operational structures, the root systems that affirm the operational structures, and also the areas of influence and how they're carried out. What are the sources of wealth within that, and like the indulgence of that. So when you think about indulging in something, it's like a kind of a dedicated practice. What are the types of external and internal oppression that is present within a kingdom, a nation, a land, a dynasty, a territory, a state, a county, a city? Because the types of internal and external oppression will tell you also the areas of influence. It will also tell you the operational structures, not only that facilitate wealth, but also facilitate oppression. And then we'll also kind of tell you the inner workings and infrastructures of what altar is erected, or what altar is has the territory of that land, has the territorial, not only spiritual, but physical boundaries and markings of that land, and is also controlling the areas of influence, the operational structures, the root systems that affirm it all, the sources of wealth, who's able to acquire wealth, who's able to maintain wealth, and who wealth is kept from. Another indicator that you should look at is cultural practices and what corporate identity is. So when you look at the culture, so I would take like where I live, for instance, right, in Washington State, because I won't take like the city of Tacoma, but Washington State as a whole, there's a lot, like we're a melting hub, right? There's a lot of cultural practices, there are a lot of religions, there's a lot of churches, there's a lot of places of worship, there's a lot of altars, and the corporate identity of Washington State's a little bit different because we're on the Pacific Northwest. So on the West Coast, it's kind of like everything's chill, everything's slow. So there's a corporate identity of like moving more slower. There's a corporate identity of like comfort. And so a lot of people here lean into their places of comfort. They're not as bold. They don't step out and do a lot of things. Now, that's not for everyone, but like I'm talking about the totality of this region. They prefer comfort. Their places of comfort. They're people of comfort, they're circles. I noticed that a lot of people that are here, they don't really travel or go from home. Now, they will travel for work, or, they will travel. There are people that travel, but for the most part, it's like, this is home. Like, there's not a willingness to branch out, or if they're going to branch out, it's very selective. So that's a kind of like indicators of corporate identity. And that's like, I'm talking about all across Washington. I've met a lot of people, and that's a corporate identity, but it's also a cultural practice when we talk about social and cultural practices outside of religion. And that's just like kind of the social and cultural practice of Washington. Washington coins itself, everybody within Washington coins itself as being a liberal state. And so with that, there comes a lot of views that are welcomed. And so they kind of have this thing where it's like, well, everyone's welcomed here, but also under the layer of that, when we talk about the types of internal and external oppression, we talk about racism, right? Racism is not in your face here like it is in the South. It's very overt. It's very covert. It's very rooted in systems. So when we talk about operational structures, within Washington State, within the Pacific Northwest, because we're talking about Oregon as well, and some of the other states that are around us, their operational structures are also the very thing of not only that determine the sources of wealth and areas of influence, but it also mitigates and also perpetuates the internal and external oppression. So our oppression here is very systemic, and it's so systemic, and it's so like, this is the thing I can use because I can't think of the word, but it's so like this, that you wouldn't necessarily, like, if you were an outsider looking in, you wouldn't be able to see it because of how liberal the state is and how everyone is very accepting of things, right? But the systems, the internal and external oppression is very systemic. The racism here is very covert. Everyone that really knows it and that kind of works in systems work, which is what I kind of do in systems work, they know it as well, and they'll admit it. So that's also a cultural practice, right? That's also a corporate identity, is kind of like, we don't really talk about it, but we act upon it. But it's, the bias, the microaggressions, the tension, all of it is systemic. So it's all rooted in the systems and the administration and how things are governed within Washington State. The next indicator to look out for is spiritual covenants and rituals, and like the demand of covenants and rituals. And so this is also going to kind of go back into cultural practices and identities and corporate identities, with being in Washington State as the example. There's a lot of spiritual covenants. There are a lot of rituals, because there are a lot of cultural practices. We have people from all over the world, right, that live here, the families that live here. And so there's a lot of that. And so I think that also kind of speaks to why there's wealth and vitality here in Washington, especially within tech and within certain industries. And most people from different countries come here because of that vitality and that wealth, and to be able to really make the type of money, depending on the industry, that they wouldn't be able to make in other countries or other regions of the world. So that's something. And then the last indicator is always going to be the priests, the altars, and the deities. So when you talk about spiritual covenants and rituals, you're just not doing them just because you want to do them. No, you're doing them because if you're not an appointed priest, you're a person that's part of the corporate worship and corporate identity that's backed behind these covenants and altars. And so there are priests, right? There are priests that are selected. There are priests that govern these areas of worship, that govern also these operational structures, that govern these root systems, because they have to man that covenant, they have to man that altar. And so kind of looking around, I mentioned before, there's a lot of like trolls. There are so many statues of trolls that I really didn't know, because I remember I was like, I want to do something fun. I think it was last summer I wanted to do something fun. And I kept seeing like these different landmarks, like, oh, go visit this or go visit that. And I remember looking at the pictures and like seeing these big like troll looking things, right? And it was like, oh, these are, I forgot what they call them. I think there's like 7 or 8 of them, like I mentioned earlier. But those are also erected altars. There are altars all over this state that we might not even know. Some might be buried under the ground, you know what I mean? So there's a lot of different priesthoods as well. Again, because we're such a cultural hub, there's a lot of different priesthoods, and so there's also a lot of different deities. We have Muslims, we have Buddhists, we have people that practice Islam. There's so many, right? We're also on a Native American territory, which all over the world is kind of Native American territory, but with being on Native American territory, they believe and they worship different deities, right? They believe that everything has a spirit. They believe, the sun is a spirit, the moon is a spirit, the water is a spirit, the earth is a spirit, this is a spirit, that is a spirit. They believe everything has spirits, and so they worship and give reverence to a lot of different deities, right? And with that, we are on a lot of Native American territory, and so there are a lot of altars, there are a lot of priesthoods, whether it's ancient priesthoods that are still impact, because altars, the effect of an altar is by way of the land dedication, also by the altar, the priest that mans the altar, that mans the covenant, that stays, I can't think of the word, but that stays committed to the act of worship that is required for that altar, for that specific deity, and also for whatever they're asking for. And so then these kind of altars are spread out regionally, as geographic. And so you can understand, again, the key indicators, and these are like indulgences of a nation, a kingdom, a dynasty, a city, a territory, a landmark, by these specific indicators: the areas of influence, the operational structures that are in place, the root systems that affirm these operational structures and areas of influence, the sources of wealth that come out of it, right? Who also is able to attain wealth, and that could also lead into the types of internal and external oppression, because it's like, this is who's able to obtain it, this is who's able to build and grow, this is who does not have access, right? The points of access. Also cultural practices and corporate identity, things that are common, things that are just like, oh well, we do this here, or in this region we just do this, right? Those are all corporate identities that are tied into cultural practices, right? Spiritual covenants and rituals, and then also you'll be able to then identify the priests, the altars, and deities, right? The connection of the covenant, and what covenant you're living under, what covenant is operating right under your feet, and you have no idea. But you see these different things, you see these different identities, you see these different things in cultures and things that are normal, that are said that these are normal, but when you look at it from an optics point of view, it's actually like, oh, actually this altar is in effect. There's a covenant here. There's a priest manning this covenant, right? Manning this altar, right? Giving of sacrifices, having rituals and things like that. And you'll understand that rituals can look different. Sacrifices can look different based on what the deity is requiring, right? So some people do blood sacrifices. Some people do sacrifices of animals. Some people do sacrifices of people, right? Sometimes the sacrifice, it's just a lot. There's just a lot. And so how this relates to the effectiveness of the altar between Pharaoh and the effectiveness of the altar between Abraham. So again, Pharaoh, they worshipped over 2,000 deities. And so that gave them the power, that gave them the prominence, that gave them everything that they needed. And so Pharaoh was, again, it was so funny when I was actually reading this, because I was like, now there's a famine in Canaan, and Canaan is not too far from Egypt. So I'm like, while there's a famine going on, you're telling me that Pharaoh's out here scouting wombs? Like, he's out here scouting for women, and there's a whole famine going on. But when I thought about it, I was like, that makes sense, because when nations are destabilized, whenever calamity happens, whether earthquake, tornado, tsunami, famine, that not only just happens in Canaan, whatever nations, whatever countries, whatever territories were connected to Canaan, you think about trade, you think about imports, exports, you think about all these other transactional things that happen between us and different nations. Whenever one nation is impacted, those nations are impacted as well. Their nest eggs, their cash cows are impacted as well. Their infrastructures, their political and economic infrastructures are impacted as well. Their systems are impacted as well. Their industries are impacted as well. And so it's like, I could see why a famine is the perfect time. Well, I'm not saying that it's just within a famine, but within this story, why the famine was the perfect time for Pharaoh to be scouting for women to add to his harem is because nations are destabilized. People are looking for stability. People are looking for security. People are looking for, even just to man, what they have and just, so that they don't experience loss. You know what I mean? And so when people are doing that, they are also making temporary decisions that they feel are diligent and they feel that will keep them in a place of containment, like keep them, in a place where it's like, okay, well, I know I'll be good. So other countries where it's like they don't really have that diligence and they already don't really have that cash flow and prominence within their nation or territory, that where a famine can hit. Because sometimes people say the phrase like, oh, you're just $1 away from being homeless, or you're just $1 away or a check away from being in poverty, right? Which means that people are usually living paycheck to paycheck. So anything like a famine, anything like their pay being docked, even their check being a day or two late, right, is something that they can't handle infrastructurally within, their home, that it might impact and might have great impact. And so, sometimes people panic, sometimes people don't know what to do, sometimes people freeze, other times people just make decisions because it's like, well, I need something to hold me over. And that's kind of what Abraham did, was like, there's a famine, I have a lot, but still I need something to kind of hold me over to keep me through this, because I don't know, he didn't know how long the famine was going to be. So him going to Egypt was like, oh, that's a great thing, they're prominent, I can, work his resources and maintain, right? However, no, that was a decision he should not have made, because then it put him in the line of sight of Pharaoh, put him and his wife in the line of sight of Pharaoh. And Pharaoh's out here like, yes, I know. And it's actually Pharaoh's men that saw Sarah before Pharaoh even saw her. So Pharaoh has, again, the institution, the systems and structures in place, the priests that are appointed to man the altar. So how do you man an altar of Pharaoh? How do you man the covenant of multiple 20,000 deities, right? They, like Pharaoh's concubine, his harem, his secondary wives was like a whole thing, right? Not just of birthing children. Like I mentioned, they were a nursery. So they nurtured the women that he brought in, right? Taught them culture, language. They raised their kids. There was a whole institution and systemic infrastructure set up to keep this thing going, because it extended his dynasty, not just within the confines of all the territories that he owned, but also internationally. So people can think about, if something happens in the US, they think about China, they think about Russia, they think about all these other places where it's like, oh, these are places of prominence. If I can just put my money there, or if I can just get there, then I know I'll be good, right? Or if I can find a way to get in the market. And so that's what Pharaoh was in the market of. He was in the market of acquiring women because he knows that other people in the market of pawning their daughters. Diplomats, priests, other people in governance are in the market of pawning their daughters to be able to maintain, right? It kind of reminds me of Bridgerton, because I always tell people, like, I kind of relate some of my business and my consulting that I do in systemic work to Bridgerton, and not like all the sex, money, and lies and things like that, but like when you think about the back end of Bridgerton, right? When you take out all the debutante balls and the gossip and the murder and just all those sexual scenes and things like that, you look at the base of it. The base of it was survival. They weren't just pawning their daughters. They weren't just spending all of this money that they didn't have or did have. They weren't putting all this investment into their daughters for nothing. Their womb was currency, right? Their daughters marrying high prominent men of stature, of that was backed behind wealthy infrastructure. was to keep the family going, right? That was familial protection, right? And so that's the coin of Bridgerton. I know, and just in history, it's been a thing for you can look at every ancient civilization, they all did the same thing. It was for survival. It was for vitality. If you could get your daughter to marry the Prince of Wales, who was connected to the oil and connected to all these things, then that ensured your lineage, that ensured your legacy, that ensured not only the wealth needed that she could then take care of her family, but it also ensured alliances. A lot of those families also had businesses, and so their businesses needed not just to be within their industry, they needed to be within other industries, because when their industry, like for now, like think about sewing, like so in the sewing and fashion community, fast fashion has taken over. Joann's has closed down. So in industries like that, there are adjacent industries that still work with fashion, right? And people in fashion need to be having alliances and people within those industries to keep their industry going. So that's kind of what Bridgerton was back in those days. That's what it was. The base was survival. So that's exactly what was playing out right in this scenario. And this case study with Pharaoh versus Abraham was survival. Abraham knew he had what he had, but he was like, let me just go over here for a little bit till the famine's over. Let me, keep what I got and make a little bit more, because he knew that, and everyone knew at that time, that ancient Egypt, it was very prominent, was a great investment, that like you would receive a great return on your investment, right? You gonna walk out of there with a little bit more than what you came, right? Which is what a lot of us do. And so yeah, but he didn't understand at the time that the harem, the whole compound of the secondary wives, the concubines, the harem, the daughters of acclimated and famous political people, was all for dynastic building, but at the core of it was fertility. He had rights to women's wombs. And so when we think about the rights and things happening now, the legislation, the policies, that's what's playing out. Like, they want the right to women's wombs, the right to fertility, because the right to fertility gives them the right and the control of life, right? Because the womb bears life. It brings life forth. It brings all things new, right? And so when you can control the central life force, the canal, the incubation of new life, you have everything, right? Because he already had riches. He already had everything, but that's what he didn't have. Now, you could say Pharaoh had a lot of already secondary wives and children running around. But for him, it's like, actually, the more wives, the more better, because it was a part of their kingship and their duty, right? So before, in like the beginning civilization of ancient Egypt, it was like, oh, I could have a couple wives because I want to. But as the dynasties kept going forward throughout the centuries, it became like a king like duty, like a rightful duty of the king. And also the secondary wives, like, they were bound by like they were never leaving. So even just think about the reproduction that was going forth. I call it coerced reproduction because that's pretty much what it was. He was coercing them into reproduction. But also at the same time, he was enacting barrenness on the women, because yes, you take all the fruitful vitality and life force of a woman's womb. You have them training not only their children, other children, the other young women and girls that you're bringing in to the compound to come be a part of this, so that you can extract their fruitfulness, and you're showing them how to man the policies, the diplomats, man alliances, and giving them the duty of like, yeah, and because I brought you over, it's not just the woman that is of duty, her family is of duty to Pharaoh now, because whatever alliances their family has, that woman is that's her duty to man those alliances, to make sure that they're strengthened, to make sure that they expand. So there's just a lot. But also when I say it enacted barrenness, is because these women were of duty to Pharaoh and Pharaoh only, right? And also it wasn't just duty to Pharaoh, it was duty to the altar, right? Because Pharaoh is just a seated position. Pharaoh's really a system. It's an institution. But Pharaoh, the man, is just a seat of power. But the institution as a whole, the Pharaoh's institution is a system of oppression. So they were actually bound to the system of oppression by way of a man sitting in an authority seat, which was all backed by an altar, which was backed by a covenant and a sacrifice made, and continual sacrifices made to an altar to various deities, right? So even of what the women were called to do, the rights to fertility wasn't just Pharaoh's, it was actually the deity. So the deity behind Pharaoh, the deities behind Pharaoh actually were able to acquire the rights to the wombs of these women, right? That it also enacted barrenness, because they might have dreams, they might have passions, they weren't able to fulfill that. Their duty was that of manning the alliances, diplomacy, political infrastructure systems, and also the continuation of this secondary harem. They called it ornaments of the king compound. That is what you do. They had no parental rights, so even their parental rights were taken from them, so their children were not even theirs. Now their children lived with them in the secondary compound, but they were not of them, so they could not even handle the affairs, the discipline, none of that. They did not have a right to that. They could only indoctrinate, right? They could only educate by way of the doctrine that they were given, of the cultures and the standards and the systems given to the position, the administration, and the systemic structures from the deity. And so, yeah, his altar, you would say, that was pretty an effective altar. Absolutely, because he had so many people, he had so many priests, there was so many forms of worship going on. They had a schedule, where I talked about in the other teaching, where they had a calendar of, not just calendar of tracking the Nile River and knowing when it would overflow and flood, and when they would need to do their agriculture. All their agriculture, their prominence, the Nile flood was all related to the rituals and the worship and to the altars of the deities that they served. So if they never kept track of all the daily things that they needed to do, the quarterly things, the yearly things, they were not manning the altar correctly. And so he had priests and appointed people within those systems to continue to make sure that the effectiveness of that altar was secure. And so I kind of also wanted to read a little bit about how the altars extended into lifestyle, way of life, and marriage. And I kind of already started on it. So what kind of made me think, and this is a good example, hopefully this is a good example. This is something I was thinking about last night. But when I talk about how altars extend into lifestyle, marriage, way of life, so I kind of think about, and I am going to use Mexican culture or Latin America, but I don't know if all parts of Latin America do this, but I know specifically for Mexicans, they have the Day of the Dead, right? So you would think the Day of the Dead is just a yearly celebration where they honor their ancestors, and they have all these, they eat, go to the graves and eat with there's a lot, right? But when I talk about altars extending into lifestyle, so the Day of the Dead is just, it's a yearly thing, right? But they have things they do as a lifestyle and a way of life daily, right? That kind of facilitate that once a year celebration. But that's also backed by altar and worship to the deities and the deities and the things that and the gods that they believe in, right? And one example that came to mind that I know also is how they'll, I think it's called a ofrenda. It's something like that. I think it's called a ofrenda. I might be wrong, but forgive me if I mispronounce it. But they have it in their house. It's like an altar. It's an altar. They have an altar in their house, right? And it has pictures of all the people that's passed within their families. They keep it, right? They keep it clean. They put fruit there. They, offer it like offerings and worships. It's a daily thing. It's, a yearly thing. It's a way of life. It's a way of lifestyle. And so that's one of the examples I can think of at the time when I talk about how, the altars, when you talk about deity worship, it looks different. A lot of it is modernized. But how it's not just for ancient Egypt, when the Nile floods, oh, we have to come do these rituals so the Nile floods. No, it's actually a daily thing that leads them into quarterly things, then that leads them into yearly like celebrations. But they're giving offerings, they're giving fruit, they're giving blessings, they're giving all these things daily. It's kind of like for Christians, like how we pray and how we, attend church and all these things and worship and fellowship. Like, it's with every religion, with every deity that has a religion attached to it, that has an altar, that has protocols and systems in place of worship and how to worship that deity. It's an everyday thing. It's a lifestyle. I also talked about, there's another example. Thank you. Holy Spirit, about yoga, right? So people think like yoga is like, it's exercise and it's moving, right? It's a little bit more than that. Yoga is a everyday practice. It's a lifestyle practice. Now, a lot of the monks and a lot of the priests that practice it, when you think about, I know people say, it makes me feel good, it makes me feel calm. That's the point. They had to practice that daily because they were also, yoga is a form of worship to deities, right? They have a lot of different deities in that religion. And so each position gives worship and gives adoration and praise to that specific deity, right? So when you think about when someone's doing a whole yoga routine and they're doing all these tree poses and things like that, each pose they're actually giving homage and praise and worship to that deity, because that's another form of worship, of how they worship the deities, right? And also in doing in those poses and staying in those poses and breathing and meditating, and sometimes they hum and sometimes they say different things throughout those poses. That's also a form of worship, but it's also a form of, when you talk about people like, I feel calm, I feel relaxed. I know they talk about alchemy a lot, or like tuning into like your inner self and that inner force and being. That's because that was a way of relaxing them to be able to be like possessed by the deity. So they weren't just worshiping a deity being like, I worshipped you. No, this is how the deity could live in that person, live in that priest. And it was a daily thing, right? So we're thinking it's just exercising and moving is making me feel good. Yeah, it's making you feel good for a reason, because that they needed to be in that place of peace. They needed to be in that place of alchemy, because that is the playing field, or the level within the spiritual realm that deity reigns in. And so that was their way of communicating not only to the deity, but allowing and opening their body to that deity. And so you think about, some people practice it daily, and a lot of them practice it daily. It's a part of a daily ritual. It's a lifestyle, right? It's also a part of culture, and it's also a part of identity. So we think about some of the things like this. It's not only just a one-time thing or like a yearly thing. A lot of these are inundated within lifestyles, even down to like how some of them pick their fruit, or how some of them process their fruit. I know when they talk about halal, right, and they talk about meat and how they process their meat. I was just doing research on that because I was watching a video and they were saying, they process it differently. Yes, they, have their way of processing it, but they also, give blessing and honor to that deity that they serve. So, it's down to even just the small things that we do within our lifestyle every day that gives and propels that, when I talk about corporate identity and like character and the characteristics of that and what people identify as, and that leads even into marriage. I know that in ancient Egypt, they would, not have marriage ceremony. Sometimes they would, but they would say the final step of marriage, even after they've been married for a while, they would go to the priest, and the priest would bless them, and the deities would bless them, and they would, ask and do these rituals for the deities to bless their marriage and fertility and things like that. So even that comes into marriage and way of life and lifestyle. And sometimes the everyday things we do are of worship to deities that we don't even know, of altars that have been erected before us. And so, so the final step of marriage was blessings from the priest and deities. And so marriage in this time, especially in ancient Egypt, was strategic love and affection. So it was we like love and affection, but it's very strategic. I'm here to acquire, I'm here to build. And it was also focused on alliances and kingdom mobility for Pharaoh. And so this practice ensured peace and stability. It prevented potential conflicts. Pharaoh's choice of a queen was a crucial decision as it could shape the empire's future and the course of history. Women were expected to be subordinate to their husbands, yet they held crucial roles in managing the household in ancient Egypt. Their rights were often defined by legal, religious, and social norms, which then could limit personal freedom, but sometimes granted influence within family settings. So yeah, just, down to the altar, the worship, and how that impacted marriage, how that impacted lifestyle, how they impacted how they view and saw alliances and agreements and, business, every part of way of life, And so there was a couple of things I wanted to say. Remember, and I'm not hearing anything. Yeah, I'm not hearing anything else. I'm not hearing anything else. So I think that's it. I'm going to close out the teaching. But I just want to leave you with, again, the effectiveness of an altar is so important, and it's something important for you to recognize patterns to, and that results that you see within the land are determined by the altar, the priest, the sacrifice, and the deity. That these covenants and the altar is to. Don't forget that the indulgence that you can see, the patterns, I should say, indicators, key indicators to see is areas of influence, operational structures, the root systems that affirm all of this, sources of wealth, types of internal and external oppression, cultural practices and corporate identity, spiritual covenants and rituals, and then again, priests, altars, and deities. And then also how all of these also impact the way of life, lifestyle things, everyday life, to all also like things done quarterly, like quarterly celebrations, yearly celebrations. It also influences marriage, birth, life, giving, the education, indoctrination of children, lineage, generational things. And so it's really important for us to just know these things, to recognize these things, to understand how all of these elements play a role as to why this specific pharaoh is coming for the remnant, and what's tied to the remnant is the rights to the womb, the rights to fertility, the right to life, because if it can control the life force, if it can control what brings life, it can control the destinies of generations and lineages after. It can control purpose, it can delay purpose, it can delay or snatch the inheritance. And so yeah, it's just something to reflect on. Am I part of the remnant? Where have I sold myself short? Where has there been uncertainty in my life that I've made temporary decisions that end up becoming permanent resting places where I have lost more than I've gained, right? Where have I been trading myself, for crumbs from the king's table, all those things. These are things to think about. These are things to reflect on. These are things to see, like, where is the system of Pharaoh playing out in our society now with everything that's going on nationally, internationally, and local? Where is the system of Pharaoh even playing out within our institutions, within our communities, within our families? Where are the patterns and things? Where there have been erected altars of worship, covenants to deities, that also relate to familial things, relate to lifestyle, relate to like the prominence of certain these nations and things that are rising. What's backing that altar? What is backing that nation? So yeah, there's just so much that you can bring or come to conclusions from this. I was just trying to review to make sure I got everything, but I did get everything. And there's additional questions that I'll leave in the description for you to kind of ponder upon and ask yourself. And the fact that lineage is important, destiny is important, promise is important, and the promise and destiny of your lineage is important. So how you steward what you have now will determine if inheritance is lost, which I think even a lot of us can say, like, yeah, there's not much to inherit, right? So from there you can start tracking, okay, where was inheritance lost? What happened? What moved? What pharaohs? What other systems? What system of oppressions were in place that inheritance was lost? Where within my lineage and family of descendants before me, ancestors before me, that, you know, there was certain decisions, temporary decisions, or decisions that they felt were great decisions, but end up, you know, where they might have acquired or felt safety or comfort or security, but they end up losing their inheritance, right? They end up losing the right, their rights, right? Where is their barrenness? Where is their brokenness? Where is their duty and honor to kings or to forms of worship or lifestyle or social norms that then negate the fertility, the vitality of purpose and calling? And so, yeah. Yes. All those things. So, yeah, I thank you for watching. Again, this is part 3 of this Pharaoh versus Abraham. So thank you for watching. I will be posting this on YouTube. Comment, like, subscribe. If something sticks out to you, feel free to comment. All comments, discussions are welcomed. Would love to see, like, what you thought of or what came to mind. And yeah, thank you for watching, and I will see you on the next live teaching. Bye.